Hello, this is Sheila Hollis. I'm the Acting Executive Director of the United States Energy Association, and we have the honor of working closely with USAID, and in particular on a series on cybersecurity in the energy arena. And I think you'll find it an extraordinary, exceptionally insightful, and although it's an overused term, I'll use it here, cutting edge discussion of some of the really essential issues that face the entire energy industry, and for that matter, the entire world with respect to cybersecurity. I'm honored to be part of this, and on behalf of the United States Energy Association, we cannot be prouder and happier than we are to work with USAID, particularly on issues of such worldwide significance, and to do it with the best and the brightest. I've had the frightening experience of working with a grid in the grid in a major blackout, and working with a number of players in this in my prior life, and so it's a pleasure to be among these truly brilliant and insightful people. I am going to pass the baton to Jamila and let her take it from here. Our first major speaker is going to be Andy Bachman, who is a senior grid strategist at the Idaho National Lab and Homeland Security Directorate. In this role, he provides strategic guidance on a variety of topics on the intersection of grid security and resilience, and as well as the senior to NH&S leadership, and also to senior U.S. and international government industry leaders. So with that, I will pass the baton for the moment, and we'll be back with you momentarily. Jamila.
Thank you, Sheila. We are honored to have you, Sheila, to host our panel today. And I welcome everybody to our second and final of the year USAID, USEA Energy Sector Cybersecurity Industry Panel. Today's panel is on cyber risk management through measurement. I'm Jamila Amodeo, Senior Energy Advisor with USAID's Global Center for Environment, Energy, and Infrastructure. As Sheila mentioned, we have worked through 15-part cybersecurity digitalization webinar series, which reached more than 4,000 participants from 70 utilities in 68 countries. If you missed any of the modules of this series, you can find the links to their recordings and presentations on the USEA website. Additionally, in the beginning of the year, all participants of these webinars, or even if you did not participate, you will be able to download a utility introduction to cybersecurity manual that will be based on those on the information in those 15 webinars. Also, starting next year, we'll start the Business Innovation Partnership Initiative, implemented in collaboration with the USEA Energy Utility Partnership Program, where we will invite 5 utilities from around the globe to partner with advanced utilities to collaborate on change management and business process innovation. Utilities participating in the program will receive support from experienced facilitators, coaches, utility mentors to develop comprehensive action plans detailing how a pilot project could tackle a specific cyber, digital, or energy management system challenge within their organization. Our industry panels originated in response to multiple requests from webinar attendees who requested information on market trends, practical tools, and also recognizing that in the current environment, it's quite challenging to meet with cybersecurity firms in person to learn about their products and services. We're bringing top US cybersecurity experts to you. You can learn about latest industry tools for measuring utility cybersecurity risk from the comfort of your own office or home, wherever you are in the globe at this moment. And we thank our dynamic industry expert moderator, Andy Bachman from Idaho National Lab, who agreed to moderate these panels for us. On behalf of USAID, I would like to thank Andy and each of our today's panelists for joining us to share their expertise and insights on this subject. Also, I want to thank Jason Christopher from Dragos, Tim Conway from SANS, and Andy who presented in our webinar series previously throughout the year. These cybersecurity webinars and panels would not have been possible without the tireless work and dedication of our USCA colleagues, Johanna Kuhlmans-Benen and Jake Swanson. Finally, I would like to thank all the participants and attendees of these webinars who joined us from around the globe. With that, I will pass the floor to our moderator, Andy Bachman.
Jamila and Sheila, thank you very much for the kind introduction and helping our audience get oriented. And audience, attendees around the world, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It is our pleasure and our privilege to be able to speak with you today. And we're going to try to impart some good information that makes this time well spent. We understand, like us, that you are having your own experience with COVID and the pandemic, and it certainly is a tough time to try to do anything, including to do business work, especially of the most important kind that's involved in protecting critical infrastructure, including the grid. 2020 is, with the arrival of December, 2020 is almost over, and I wish that felt as promising as it sounds, but I have a feeling that next year is going to be a little bit, at least in the beginning, is going to be a tough start too. So everybody hang in there, please. Again, appreciate your time, and let's go. You're going to enjoy this, I think. There's a famous management saying that's passed around quite a bit. I'm sure you've seen it on other slide decks, and maybe you've used it yourself. It's, you can't manage what you can't measure. It's a call to quantification and using metrics. It is, in fact, the title of our talk today. But if you do a little background research on that statement, you'll find that while it is taken to be complete truth, it's also apocryphal, or in other words, that's not what the management guru Edward Demings actually said. What he really said was, it is wrong to suppose that if you can't measure it, you can't measure it. That's almost an entirely different meaning than what it was reduced to and spread around. But ultimately, both of those statements, you can't manage what you can't measure, and it's wrong to suppose that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it, both work, meaning that to succeed, you don't have to force measurement on things or of things that can't be measured. But it really is nice when you can use data, when there is data available, to make baselines, figure out where you are now, to track progress after you've made some important decisions, which leads to what I call Buchman's somewhat less famous maxim number 1, loosely based on the first of SANS top 20 base cybersecurity practices, best practices. You can't secure what you don't even know you have. This is really a comment on asset management and inventory and discovery, but it's something that is a challenge facing every complex enterprise, and particularly electric utilities who have so much diverse equipment spread out that they have to take care of. That said, once you know what's most important to your organization fulfilling its mission in business or national security or both, you can monitor human and machine cybersecurity performance criteria and make adjustments to keep moving to better, more secure, higher ground. And therein lies the subject of our talk today. Got 4 amazing people for you. And the first one is going to be Jason J.D. Christopher. He's Principal Cyber Risk Advisor at Dragos, a company you may have heard of if you're in the OT space at all. Jason is a longtime friend, and to many is the godfather of grid security metrics. So having him here is a real coup. That's really appropriate. Here's a quick background on him. He's the CTO, prior to his stint at Dragos, was the CTO of Axio, a company you'll be hearing more from in just a few minutes. He was security metrics leader at EPRI. You
Am I the only one who also lost Andy?
No.
Yeah,
All
we
right.
lost. Yeah.
It's awkward for me to do my own bio, but I can do a little bit of my own bio. So I am the principal cyber risk advisor here at Dragos, meaning that I'm taking some of the measurement stuff that Andy was discussing and making it actionable for utilities primarily. That's my focus. But we focus on industrial firms. So if you saw my talk previously, where I said, well, what's the zeros and ones that we care about the most in the energy sector? It's not the zeros and ones that's the data, that's the email servers. It's the zeros and ones that allow us to do reliable operation, right? The ones that let our engineers understand what they are operating and therefore how to protect them. So prior to that role, I've had many roles within industry, including what Andy had discussed, both at Axio and at EPRI. And prior to that, I worked for the US federal government at the US Department of Energy and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, which you'll hear about a little bit later with Tim Conway talking about the NERC CIP standards. So there's a lot of confluence here in this panel I think is really awesome, just from all the different expertise that we have that we're bringing to you from our previous talks, as well as some of the technology we'll be discussing today. So for Dragos, if you want to hit to the next slide, just a very quick recap of the company if you've never heard of us. We focus primarily, again, on the industrial space. So there's this idea of what happens in the corporate side of our environments, as well as what's happening within the industrial side, the zeros and ones that are opening something, closing something that impact the physical world. That was what I had spent some time on in our previous discussion. You can see here, from the Dragos perspective, you're actually getting the sort of experience of multiple former asset owners themselves, meaning that we were the engineers that were on the ground. We were the ones who were securing this equipment. And we come from that from a lot of different perspectives to put that into one product that I'll talk about on the next slide. And we'll just hit next. There we go. So I love that Andy started with, you cannot protect what you do not know. And it's one of the things that when we talk about the industrial space, the operational technology, the OT part of the equation, that is really difficult for a lot of organizations, especially if they're just getting started in measurement or management of that problem. If you talk to your engineers, they may say, yes, I know what that equipment is. But do they really? If you don't have the data, how do you know? If you don't have the visibility, how can you ascertain? Well, one of the things that our platform does is it passively looks at what those assets are, which is really important because in IT, they'll talk about active scanning and they'll talk about a lot of other technologies that just don't work in the OT industrial space. As a matter of fact, if you run some of those IT tools, you may have a reliability event as a result because this technology is, again, decades old in some cases, and it's not used to some of the new technologies or new scanning techniques that are used in IT specific pieces. What the platform also does, if you click on the next button, is take a look at all the different threats that are out there. So actually providing some sort of, I know what my assets are. Now, what's the information flow that they're providing? What's the communications that are going back and forth? And because we have a stellar intel shop here, what are we seeing from the intelligence side that may say, you know, that's anomalous behavior? Your equipment should not be doing that. That is probably an indicator of somebody doing something incorrectly, or that you may have an activity group, an adversary in your industrial systems, which again are our crown jewels, the things that we're trying to protect from the operations perspective. And then one more click to round out what we do within the platform. We also understand that not everybody has the expertise that you may need to respond to these types of incidents. A lot of people don't have sort of the classic training that comes with cybersecurity in the industrial space because it is really relatively niche and relatively new industry. And so what we also provide are playbooks, investigation sort of guides that if you found something from those previous two things, what do I do next? Who do I call? How do I manage an investigation to try to track down what could be happening? And then lastly, we'll click on the next slide, and you can probably click one more time here too. If all of that is overwhelming, don't worry. Another thing that we do is what's called Neighborhood Watch, where we can actually offset your team with our industry experience. So if you have the platform running and you're still not sure what to do next, we can provide some additional expertise with our team, with our sort of subject matter experts, including myself, to help you with that next step as to what it is you should be looking at. So all of that sort of wrapped into one to be able to be a little bit more proactive, but also understand that you may not have the resources to have a team dedicated or to understand alarms and alerts that are happening. So we'll be able to offset that for you. And if you have any questions about anything, because I know that this was a quick time, you can email info@dragos.com and we'll be able to provide you with more information on that.
All right, Jason, thanks very much. And everyone, I apologize. I understand I was suboptimal when I was speaking, trying to introduce Jason. We got halfway through it. As you can tell, he doesn't really need too much of an introduction because he carries the show once he gets started. Assuming you can still hear me, even if you can't see me. Actually, Jason, if you could lip sync to what I'm saying, it'll be a more human experience. I'm going to introduce now speaker number 2, Stephen Boyer. He's the co-founder and CTO of Bitsight. I had the pleasure of meeting him a long time ago. Well, it feels like a long time ago when they were just getting started in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And I'm a Boston area person too, so it wasn't hard to pay him a visit. So over the last decade or so, Stephen and his colleagues have created one of the most successful cybersecurity companies in the world. That's my own characterization. I don't know if it's true according to all the metrics, so to speak, but man, they sure are doing a great job. With thousands of customers who've used Bitsight technology to evaluate hundreds of thousands of other companies, as well as themselves. That's pretty amazing. In addition to an earlier startup other earlier startup successes, he also worked at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, in some ways a sister laboratory to where I work at the Idaho National Lab, where he led research and development programs on large-scale national cybersecurity problems. So without further ado, Stephen, please take it away.
Hey, thank you, Andy, and thank you to USCA and USAID for the privilege to be here. Very distinguished set of panelists, and privileged for the opportunity to speak with you today. In the spirit of measurement, I did want to share some measurements. So the slide is a set of measurements that we've done over the last few months that I'll talk through. But at Bitsight, we're making about 250 billion measurements a day around the internet, around cybersecurity performance. Now, they're typically IT focused, where Jason had talked about really OT specific measurements, but there is a pretty big intersection with where we see that's maybe sector specific. And so about a month ago, the NSA did a pretty rare and unprecedented action where they announced 25 vulnerabilities that they were observing being exploited by nation state actors. And they put out that list to warn people, hey, if you have these, you really need to remove them or to patch or update or remove those systems, because those systems are at risk. And so part of our measurement that we do at Bitsight is to do an internet assessment. We call that an internet census. And we go in and communicate with these systems in a non-intrusive way and try to determine, are they vulnerable to these types of vulnerabilities? And what you see here in this chart is a breakdown by industry of the percentage of systems that we see or industries that have companies with systems with these vulnerabilities. And so as you look at that chart, I know we're talking about folks here in the utility sector today. The utility sector had the highest percentage of organizations with these specific vulnerabilities. And without getting too tech, these different colors are remotely exploitable vulnerabilities with very high levels of what's called with high level of CVSS, which is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which means it was fairly trivial for a threat actor to exploit these systems. And these were from back in 2019. So even now in 2020, year-old vulnerabilities are exploitable. So think about that for yourself. If there are assets that you don't know about, or assets that are not under tight control, you should be aware and measuring and looking at, hey, are there assets that are remotely exploitable and remain vulnerable that I need to address? Because from our assessments from the NSA top 25, the utility sector is one of the single most vulnerable. The next follow-on question, though, is also, well, what about my supply chain? What about the people that connect to me, that provide services to me? Are they vulnerable as well? So if you go to the next slide, Jake, Bitsight, we gather this measurement. We map all those measurements to organizations. So we look at who owns those IP address, who owns those domains and services, and then we formulate a rating. And it's a rating of performance over time. And so the more often you have these issues, the longer they last, the more severe, the worse the performance. And the faster you address those issues, the fewer issues that you have, the better the performance. And those are really applied in many use cases. But I want to, if you advance, Jake, to two couples. So I want to talk about the first one, which is how is my organization performing? We're talking about measurement here. And it's very common for the board or for the executive management team to ask, how are we doing as a business? How do we compare against our peers? How quickly are we responding to issues? How do we benchmark within our industry or against other industries or our competitors? And so we provide that with that measurement and that quantitative analysis. We're able to see, okay, how are we doing in terms of the issues that we are addressing? Are we addressing them faster or slower than our peers? Are we implementing better controls? Do we have better understanding of our assets now than we did before? And so we call that security performance management. And I'll talk about a little bit later in the questions on how you would apply that. The next one, if you advance it, Jake, is around answering that question for my supply chain. How are they doing? And what's their performance, and what risk does that bring to me? And so as I try to get deeper visibility and continuous visibility into that risk that the supply chain poses for me, I want to be able to have measurement. I want to be able to have data to drive those conversations. And so when you're thinking about building these programs for measurement, this is all done without the organization's permission. So there's no disclosure issues. This is done continuously. So you have continuous visibility into performance. Not everything. And I think Jason's presentation shows some very OT specific areas that you want to look at. These are very IT specific, but around the performance and vulnerabilities that could be exploited, that could bring challenges to you. So with that, I'll turn it back over and I'll follow up with questions later. Thank you.
Okay, hey, thank you, Stephen. It's great. Great stuff. There are definitely among board members and other senior decision makers is a hunger for quantification and not just anecdotal security by inference and hope and things like that, right? The next speaker is Brendan Fitzpatrick. He's a senior vice president at Axio, another company where Google will show you that when you're looking for security measurement, security metrics, like Bitsight, Axio is synonymous with this topic. His responsibilities there at Axio to deliver all elements of their cyber risk engineering approach for their clients, and their clients are in multiple sectors, but including energy, transportation, and financial, to help them improve their security programs. And prior to his time at Axio, Brendan was a senior staff member at the Software Engineering Institute at Carnegie Mellon, another place famous for developing metrics. So it's more than a coincidence on software development quality. And prior to that, he was in the United States Army, specializing in physical security operations, intel collection analysis, all kinds of stuff. So without further ado, Brendan, please take it away.
Thank you, Andy. So I've been at Axio for just over 4 years, and in that time, we have built a cyber risk management platform that rests on top of our risk management approach. And there's really 4 pillars to our risk management approach. We feel that any organization, be it a public entity or a privately owned company, should start the cyber risk management journey with understanding what the risks to the business are. So that is done through a cyber risk quantification activity that our software platform supports. And once you know what is uniquely at risk for your organization, the next step would be to understand how prepared you are to meet that exposure. And we have a portion of our platform designed to help you with this, conducting cybersecurity program assessments. And where I think we are a little unique from some of our competitors in this space is we also bring in insurance. So helping organizations understand if they have the financial wherewithal to survive a significant cyber event. So after we've looked at what your unique exposure is, we can compare that to the insurance coverages that you have and determine if you have the right limits and coverages in place. And then once you have all that information from the prior 3 steps, you can start to make decisions about how to prioritize what you need to do next to plug gaps. Next slide, please. So one way to talk about cyber insurance and cyber risk management is using this risk curve. A lot of us are familiar with the traditional, mathematical equations for for risks in an organization, you know, the vulnerabilities and impact equation. Here, this curve, you know, the y-axis represents the cyber risk of my organization, and the x-axis represents our capability within the organization. So when we're first starting a cyber program, or maybe we're starting a new company, we would be very high up to the left on this curve. And anything and everything that we do, like training our employees or requiring long passwords, would show significant decreases in risk initially. But as we get more and more mature, those gains are harder to achieve. It might take more employees, training, and resources in order to achieve that. So if you can build a slide, please. So at that point, it might make sense to transfer some of that risk. If I was looking at a $100 million investment in order to realize a risk reduction, or I could pay insurance premiums, in some cases, it might make sense to augment the cybersecurity program with financial controls in the form of cyber insurance. And that's one of the things that you can get through using our platform. I'll have a couple questions to answer a little later, but if you want to know anything more about Axio, you can visit our website at axio.com or email info@axio.com. Thank you, Andy.
Right on, Brendan. And yeah, we got a comment that somebody's was excited to hear that there is such a thing as cyber insurance. And I just wanted to say, yeah, it's appropriate for some types of risk management / risk transfer. That's kind of a fancy word, risk transfer decisions, things that you can't necessarily fully secure to your satisfaction.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a misnomer too, Andy. So, you know, cyber insurance was born out of network interruption insurance about 25 years ago. So a lot of the policies that are sold as a cybersecurity insurance policy are really for data breaches and network interruption. So it's kind of a misnomer, but there are policies out there, property, casualty, directors and officers, and ironically, kidnap and ransom policies that provide coverage to organizations that have exposures beyond like a traditional data breach. So if you're thinking about securing your assets that are maintaining the grid and whatnot, you know, looking at those other types of coverage beyond the traditional cybersecurity insurance might be a good idea.
Good. Tell you what, if there's follow-up questions that go beyond the purview of our short time together today, we invite attendees to mail those in, and we'll make sure we get on them to your satisfaction. The last speaker in our 4-speaker roundup is going to do their introduction slides for you, and then we'll get into a Q&A session. It is my honor to introduce my longtime friend, Tim Conway. He's the Technical Director for Industrial Control Systems and SCADA programs, some say SCADA, at the SANS Global Training Institute, Cybersecurity Training Institute. I am not exaggerating when I say Tim is perhaps one of the top 3 experts in the nation, if not the world, at the intersection of energy matters and security matters. It's always, you often have to pay a lot of money to be able to be trained by Tim or to hear from him. So today, you're not having to handle that burden. He's responsible, just quick couple notes about him, as long as my audio lasts. He is responsible for developing everything at SANS related to industrial control system and SCADA training offerings. Some of you, I bet, have been through some of the classes that he has developed or that he teaches. And if you haven't, I recommend, if there's a way to do it, to get in one of them. He's doing them in remote form right now. One of the things he's most expert on is the North American mandatory security standards for the bulk power system called the NERC CIPS. And so many countries have looked at the NERC CIPS, not to necessarily embrace them entirely, but to inform what they might do in terms of their regulation of grid security. He also has designed and often run the every other year GridX exercise that you might read about in the press, where we do a tabletop exercise across the entire North American grid and throw major security catastrophes at it and teach everybody how to respond to the best they can. He began his career at a company, a large utility, natural gas and electricity called NiSource. He's a Chicago guy. He's addicted to Dunkin' Donuts coffee, which we try to keep him supplied with because he never really sleeps. And so without further ado, Tim, please take it away.
That was very, very nice, Andy. And everything that Andy mentioned from a history and from a work perspective, there are hundreds or thousands of people involved in each of those efforts from to help me do what we do every day. Couple of items on SANS, just the organization. I've been working here for about 8 years when we started the industrial control system specific curriculum, but SANS has kind of been a part of my life professionally, working for utilities. SANS as an organization started back in 1989, and for those who are not familiar with it, primarily a cybersecurity training institute. Stands for the SANS stands for System Administration, Audit, and Network Security. Primarily kind of a research and education organization. While we do the cybersecurity training courses, we also have an arm of the organization that does credentialing and certification. If you can go to the next slide. So if our core elements are training and testing and validation with the certification program, some of the very exciting components are the things that are available from a community perspective, and SANS does an amazing amount of this type of activity. And that's really throughout my career working for the utilities, where there wasn't always enough budget for training. There was always a way to stay involved and continue learning, which is probably one of the most important things for those involved in critical infrastructure and cybersecurity specifically, is just to really have a passion for education and to continue to pursue knowledge and learning and just understanding threats and technology and innovation and how they all kind of collide together as you're trying to operate a critical component to a service. Here's some examples of some of those community outreach efforts. SANS kind of endorses and kind of pushes and helps us be in as many different webcasts or conferences or places as we could be to sort of help the community in any way we can. But we also provide a number of things, whether it's on various blogs or white papers or kind of tools for the community, virtual machine distributions and technology that you can use in forensics or in network monitoring or in penetration testing or in the industrial control system side with some very specific virtual machine distributions that we are working on as we speak. In addition, a couple of kind of resources for different veteran programs or reskilling efforts, as well as all the way down kind of into the university and high school level, helping build the practitioners that are going to come into these kind of professional industries in the future. Lots of other resources here listed. Andy had mentioned GridX, kind of talking about some of those cyber ranges and experiences. If you go to the next slide, last element here is just one of the things that we work on quite a bit within SANS is building kind of realistic ranges that align with learning objectives. Number of places that are out there that are trying to build ranges that just want the biggest, most expensive range they can get. So meaning the more endpoints you have and the more technology that you have, that must equate to a better learning experience. And from a SANS perspective, we really try to look at the learning objectives first of what does the range need to be in order, or the exercise need to cover in order for us to drive towards learning objectives that matter. And it allows us to sort of build hands-on cyber physical ranges, as well as kind of virtual ranges, depending on what the learning objectives are. But we've had a couple of opportunities. Andy and some others were able to join us as we run sort of hands-on cyber physical exercises and ranges for countrywide activity, and really start to focus on what types of standards, what types of metrics, what types of kind of goals they should have so they can start measuring themselves against them. And GridX and hands-on ranges really help highlight kind of those areas of opportunity and the areas where a country or a entity may be doing things significantly better than others. So with that, I think, Andy, I'll turn it back over to you.
Okay, Tim, thanks very much, and very well said. I'm still going to stay stealthy video-wise in the hopes that audio holds up better. Yeah, Tim and I, and other panelists here too, but certainly Tim and I's mutual experience is to live on airplanes and fly around the world with help often from organizations like USAID and USEA and the Department of Energy, et cetera. We're now obviously, like many of you, working from our perches. Tim is in the mountainous region of the United States, but he's also virtually all over the world right now, including right after this presentation today. So, all right, so now we're going to go to a more interactive version, and hopefully the technology will keep us talking here. I'm going to go back in the order of the panelists, starting with JD Christopher, and have a couple questions for each one. And panelists, I remind you to please try to keep your responses to within 2 or 3 minutes max, so that we might get to all of them and still have some time at the end to take more questions from the many excellent attendees. Okay, so Jason, JD, here we go. Your first question is, utilities and other industrial organizations may already manage risks related to safety or reliability. I sure hope they are. What's so difficult? What's so different about cyber risk? And not just cyber risk, because you can tell we've had companies and people here on our panel that are more IT oriented and some are more OT oriented. What's particularly unusual and challenging about OT or operational technology?
So that's a good question, Andy, and thank you. I really think that when we talk through risk, it's really a discussion for utilities as to what can impact our operations, right? That's the thing that we care about the most. And that's why we prioritize things like reliability and reliability risk as a construct. There are already measurements and metrics that you can do and that we have been doing for decades plus. We've been managing electric operations for over 100 years at this point. We have not had that same sort of focus on cybersecurity because it's a relatively new industry, right? If you think about how we first started with cybersecurity and thinking through the US story in particular, we started roughly 20 or so years ago because we had untargeted malware that was hitting our control centers, right? Engineers clicking on things they shouldn't have, installing things they shouldn't have, and we're trying to manage that problem, but we didn't sort of tackle it the same engineering approach way that we have for other things with safety and reliability. There are loads of data that we have when we think about the physics of the grid that we're really good at, right? We're good at balancing things because the physics equation to balance the grid hasn't changed. The physics is not going to change. Whereas the cybersecurity sort of questions constantly evolve over time. And so it requires people to have more of a pulse on it. But also going back to the very first question that you posed was, do you know what assets you have? And that's from a cybersecurity perspective. Do you know what computers are connected to the relays, to the breakers, to the things that are keeping the grid moving? And if you do you understand how they're communicating? Do you understand their cybersecurity problems with it? And therefore trying to create the right measurements to link back to sort of the things that we're talking about today for that. And the answer is normally no, because the industry itself is evolving and getting more mature with that over time compared to the safety and reliability aspects that we've been doing really well over the past 100 years.
Okay, well, the way you just described it there, I started to feel a little bit overwhelmed. Like there's so much to pay attention to. How can you know, since you're not going to be able to pay attention to everything, and you're not going to be able to secure everything to your satisfaction, with ever increasing vulnerabilities and threats that we hear about all the time, so much noise. What's really important? What can we do to prioritize and make sure we're taking care of the things we absolutely must take care of?
Absolutely. So it's understanding your crown jewels, right? As utilities, as operators, engineers understand the crown jewels really well, but we may not have put that under the same cybersecurity perspective that we have for other areas of the business. If you go into a generating facility and you ask an engineer, what's really important? What does a really bad day look like for you? They'll be able to ramble off like 5 scenarios at the top of their head, right? They've thought through this stuff because they don't want that bad day to happen. So if they think through that from the engineering perspective, the next question is, how do I protect that thing? What we'd like to do is be able to talk about it in terms of crown jewels and understanding your crown jewels and therefore putting those boundaries and protections around those first. And really, again, limiting that size, because you're right, there's a lot of noise out there. And so what's the signal? The signal is what is important to you? What is the most critical set of assets, set of devices that you can protect that will keep that generator going, that will keep the transmission of the power flowing, that will keep the distribution of the power flowing? Those are the things that you should be focusing on from a cybersecurity perspective first and foremost. And then as you mature, you can start growing from there.
Brilliant. All right, thank you. Mature, one of the keywords in the C2, M2 that we keep coming back to, right?
For sure.
Okay, now thanks JD and Stephen. You're up. You're on the hot seat. Seems like everybody, at least in my world, has been talking about and even legislating or attempting to legislate issues related to supply chain, and that's where Bitsight comes in big time. When we're thinking about supply chain challenges, what would you say are some of the most effective strategies to engage with third-party suppliers? Because so much of your or one's own cybersecurity posture depends on the cybersecurity practices and policies of the folks who supply them their services and products. How the heck do you do this? Give us at least the beginning of an idea, please.
So you asked about a strategy. I think you really need a program that has buy-in at the organizational level, and you have to recognize this is a real risk impacting you. So may I suggest some principles around what you might build that program and strategy in. One would be partnership and collaboration. You do not want this to be adversarial. You want to be a partner with those supply chain suppliers. They may be could be hardware, could be all sorts of software services, etc. You want that to be partner and collaborative. If it's adversarial, you're not going to be able to make the changes and get the risk reduction that you're looking for. One of our customers, so Starbucks, and former CISO of Starbucks and now at Chipotle, said, he would call up his peer at the other organization and just ask, how can I help? So build that principle around partnership and collaboration. The interesting thing about third party is those are their systems. Those are their controls. You can't change those. You can influence, you can help, but that is outside of your control. So you really need to partner and collaborate. Second, the question is really around timing, and I would say early and often. The earlier you're engaging, the more likely you are to influence changes in behaviors and processes and controls, and often because this world is dynamic and issues that didn't exist before may exist now, or vulnerabilities that hadn't been present before are present now. And so this is very dynamic and changing. It's not set and forget. Oftentimes people would onboard a vendor or a supply chain partner, they would do their diligence, and then they never do anything again. 5 years later, well, things change in 5 years. And so you're wanting to be engaged often. And the third one I would use is to come with data and measurement. Now, of course, that's the theme of what we're talking about. That's something where we really specialize, is to be able to show where there may be gaps or issues in a program, historically where they had areas where they have underperformed, or where they may have had vulnerabilities or things that they hadn't addressed, and to be able to talk about those things and to have very specific areas as opposed to just general questions. Ones that we see oftentimes is, hey, do you have a vulnerability management program? And almost inevitably someone will check that box and say yes. But it's a very different conversation to say, hey, we saw that you have and had over the last few months some of those NSA 25 vulnerabilities. Are you aware of those? What are you doing about it? Do you have some sort of compensating control? So that's just a very different level of collaboration there. So you want to partner, collaborate, you want to engage early and often, and you really want to come with data and measurement.
All right, fantastic, and thank you for touching on the timing aspect. Now, some of the folks in the audience are chief information security officers or chief security officers. We say CISO sometimes, and some of the people in the audience are heading in that direction career-wise if everything goes well. I'm not sure everybody's happy once they get there, but at least it's a good thing to aim for in your career. If you wouldn't mind, once you've addressed some of the issues like you did to the first question, and you're ready to display and communicate to folks at an even higher level, the C-suite or the board, can you give the audience just a few tips for the best ways for doing those presentations? And also, this is going to be a tough part for you. Please keep this to 1 minute. Go.
So you really just need to speak the language of the business, right? You need to speak the language of the board. If you're talking in in security terms, you're going to kind of loosen them. So you want to think about risk to the business and performance. Some of the best board reports we've seen has been CISOs who say, here's our performance quarter over quarter. Here's how we benchmark against our peers and our competition. And these are the things where we project to be. And so you want to come with those metrics. These are kind of metrics that we can help provide to help benchmark, to show where that performance is. But you really want to gain the confidence of the board, because you gain that confidence, you'll get the resources that you need to tackle the challenges that you're trying to tackle.
All right, fantastic, and appreciate the content and the brevity with which you delivered it. And audience members, if we're going too fast, or if we're touching on something, and you want to know more, please come back through Jamila, Jake, and others, and get those questions back to us, and we'll try to get you a good response and good information after the fact if we can't get to it now. Brendan Fitzpatrick, it's your turn in the spotlight with 2 quick questions, please. The first question is, why is incorporating risk quantification in a cyber program a good idea? Like, what does that help you achieve by bringing, this is almost like a highest level question that we're dealing with. What are the benefits of doing this?
Great question. So Andy, a lot of times when people think of risk quantification, they falsely believe that they have to have many other processes in place before they get to that, what they consider a more senior activity. But it does 2 things for an organization, and it can work for very large organizations or very small organizations, and those with robust cyber programs or those just getting started. It's going to do, the first thing it's going to do is it's going to help the CISO or whoever's performing those responsibilities elevate that conversation around cybersecurity to the business level. Instead of standing in front of the CFO and CEO with a spreadsheet with 27,000 vulnerabilities on it, you're going to be able to say, these are the 5 or 6 things that I'm concerned about, and this is what I think it's going to cost to the bottom line. You're now speaking the love language of the senior leaders in your organization, and they can compare those operational risks that you're presenting to other risks across the business. The second benefit is something that the CISO or the cybersecurity director himself or herself will actually benefit from, and that is aligning to the business. So at least in the United States, a lot of these people serving in these senior cybersecurity roles grew up in technical roles, and they may or may not be as well versed in the business as some of their peers at the table. They're trained to perform a checklist of technical things, which are all very important in protecting the enterprise. But if they aren't understanding what the exposure is to the business, they might be doing some of those things on their checklist that aren't going to reduce the risk to the business. So ensuring that they're aligned to where the risk actually exists for the business will help them align and only be asking for things that are going to provide value back to the company.
Okay, good show. And I did see your comment in chat, but after the fact. So it's time for question number 2. So
Sure.
Assuming they're keeping those checklists that you just referred to in a spreadsheet, again, with emphasis on both quality and brevity in your response, can you tell us what happens when you use Axio platform versus spreadsheets or any other means for making this stuff happen?
Sure. Managing, you can do cybersecurity assessments and quantification activities in spreadsheets. Jason and I have done that. It's not fun. A lot of other organizations are doing that. Our platform makes a lot of that easy. It brings some best practices and insights. We have integrations with companies like Bitsight, so you can see some of their scores right there in line with your assessments. So it takes a lot of that headache away. The other thing it does is it eliminates the need to get a new assessment every year. And instead, we believe you should use a single assessment for whatever scope of the organization you're doing. And you can have past milestones, so you can see where you've been, where you currently are, and where you're going, kind of all in this one life cycle of a single assessment. Now, I'm a big believer in doing more than one assessment for an organization. And the analogy here is, like a growing family. I used to get my own physical at the doctor, and now I have 4 kids. One physical for me no longer checks the health of my family. So if I'm a growing organization, it might make sense to, at a minimum, look at the IT infrastructure side of the house as well as some of those OT things. But we have some utilities that are doing, 20, 30 different assessments across the organization. But it would make life a little bit easier for people that are trying to manage a growing set of cybersecurity responsibilities with a very small team, which seems to be the case with a lot of utilities.
Yeah, for sure. Utilities come in all shapes and sizes, and some are just little tiny organizations, and yet their responsibilities can be as heavy duty, as serious for the customers they serve as the largest and most well-financed, most best funded. All right, thanks, Brandon. Tim Conway, my man, my hopefully well-caffeinated man. I have two questions for you, should you choose to accept. The first one is, and these are purposefully designed to stretch your early morning brain in Salt Lake City. To what extent are measurement and metrics, and this is not a yes/no question, by the way, see if you can go beyond that, used in the NERC SIP program that we've all heard so much, or at least something about?
So yeah, definitely not a yes, no, and never could there be, even if I wanted to just give you a yes, no, and make you try to think of more questions for me. Specifically from kind of a NERC SIP or any audit regime or any kind of review, when you're adding the complexities of kind of cyber domain, specifically even within that, the IT and OT domain, and then physical, and then operations, and the complexity and the dynamic nature of the electric sector, there's no one right way, there's no one right answer. So kind of measuring that becomes tough. And some of the other kind of speakers speaking to board level, and even at that level, there's a message that matters to them, which is, do we have violations? And that's kind of the entry in regards to the measuring stick of, there's this notional, we had an audit and we were compliant. And when you hear people talk that way, you immediately want to go kind of further. From a board and from a stakeholder level, that may be enough. But from people who kind of work in this space, you know that that's not really true, meaning they had an audit and they're compliant. Even after auditors come into an organization and conduct a kind of 5-day audit to the NERC SIP standards, looking at each requirement, each measure, they're leaving saying we found no violations. They're not saying you're compliant. They're saying we found no violations, because they've only been there for a certain period of time and they've only looked at kind of a certain set of your devices or your assets. So kind of the real measuring stick comes from when the auditors make recommendations on how to improve your programs, or when they say, if we return and you're doing this the same way, we may be issuing a possible violation, because on the couple of things that we sampled, you were able to sort of convince us with stacked evidence that things were good. But in reality, if we looked at every single device, we probably would be able to find something if we were here long enough. So kind of that real measuring stick comes from those recommendations from entities that are running a continuous improvement program, and they're finding more and more violations. And that's really where this kind of contrary view comes, meaning from a board and a stakeholder level, that's the message that needs to be delivered. If we're running the best program and our metrics are fantastic and we're doing continuous compliance and continuous monitoring, we are going to find more violations. So that's a contrary feeling, because the message for years has been, everything is working, we're compliant. And the reality should be, in a zero deficiency program like NERC SIP, you're going to find violations if you're running kind of a leading edge continuous improvement program.
Yeah, violations are not a sign of poor performance.
Correct.
It's a sign of discovery, things that you might make better. Second question, and I must remind you the time is short, and I do have a free-for-all question when this is over, which will take approximately 4 hours for us to all answer, and we'll have about 30 seconds to do so. Actually, we'll probably try to segue into a wrap-up. But so, Tim, you've helped reinforce what should be a general truth for all security practitioners in whatever domain they're in, that compliance with whatever thing you're trying to comply with does not equal, picture out that sign that's the does not equal sign, security. It's a good step to comply with things that you need to. Obviously, your seniors insist on you doing that, but it is far from synonymous with we are a super solid, tight, well-run security operation. So that was the NERC SIP process described, or at least as the starting point for the question. For those of you Googling at home and who haven't really heard that term before, that's NERC CIP, NERC SIP, Critical Infrastructure Protection, and a group of standards built around this concept. So Tim, I also said in your bio that you're somewhat instrumental in putting together this amazing grid exercise that happens, grid cybersecurity exercise that happens every other year in North America, including the United States, but also with our friends in Canada and Mexico. when you're communicating to stakeholders in that exercise, not just the participants, how do you use metrics to let them know whether as a nation, whether as individual utilities, that we're getting better, getting worse, or treading water?
That's even harder to respond to from a metric perspective than something is what you would seem to be looking at the NERC CIP standards and seeing a requirement and a measure. You would think, oh, there's a measure, so we can measure ourselves to it. But again, there's kind of not one way to do it. There's 50 shades of CIP, and you have to kind of work your way through that. In a GridX exercise or any exercise, the metric is the learning. And you know, from an entity who has participated in an exercise year after year after year after year, and they continue to grow it, certainly there's metrics that you can point to of planning and project planning and implementation and budgets and how many people participated from which roles in the organization, to include cyber, IT, OT, physical ops. And you can measure those things. You can measure growth, and you can measure participation, and you can measure total training hours granted. But at its core, kind of, I look to it to say, how are we measuring learning from the perspective of, we have a dynamic workforce that we may have people participating in an exercise that have played it 6 times through. So are we keeping the learning objectives in line with kind of the threats that matter? Are we training to an exercise that's realistic? And is it going to make a difference if the big bad thing happens? And also knowing that there's other people participating, that this is their first year. They may have just come into the organization. They may be new to electric sector. They may be new to cyber physical types of activity, and making sure that the exercise can satisfy their learning objectives and their training needs too. You know, from a metrics perspective, there's lots of things from a project planning, participation, and training you can measure. But I think really what matters is the individual learning and the team learning aspect of, how do you work together through an event from the operations side, the physical, and the cyber. And that's really only measured kind of in each entity's lessons learned of what they identified in policies or deficiencies, and how they're going to improve it moving forward, which is the most important part of the exercise that happens at the end.
All right. Listen, because we're so close to the top of the hour, thank you, Tim, big time. Because we're so close to the top of the hour, I'm not going to drop a bomb with a particularly difficult question that will consume all the oxygen. Aware that audience members are primarily coming from outside the United States, I would like to remind you that the program GridX, which is searchable, you'll find almost everything we talked about to be easily searchable. That GridX is something that Tim has helped stand up country-specific or tailored versions of that extremely helpful exercise in multiple places around the world. And if your country or your region doesn't have something like that going yet, which is probably true for most places, there are definitely resources that are built around, that Tim has helped build, but other sources that if you come back to us with a query, we might be able to help you get off to a good start. And especially once we get past the pandemic, there's things you could do now that could help once we can be face-to-face and doing decent nationwide grid security exercises. So I'll tell you what, let's do the thing where we pass it back up the food chain here. So thank you for your time, panelists, attendees, and everyone. Please continue to be safe out there in the world. And back to you, Jamila and Sheila.
Sheila, you are on mute.
Thank you so much to this fantastic panel, and to you, Andy, for leading the way. I cannot recommend strongly enough that you go back and look through the additional sessions that are available online. This group is as smart and intense, and is packed with critical, essential information. I cannot recommend it highly enough. Having sat through about a zillion conferences as a lawyer and working almost strictly in the energy and a lot in cybersecurity arena, I can say this is by far and away the best set of programs I've ever had the opportunity to watch or be even to play a small part in. So thank you, Andy. Thanks to this extraordinary panel. And thank you again on behalf of USEA and on behalf of the country and beyond. Thank you.